Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the many schools of psychology in this video. So the first one to really start with in my mind is Wilhelm Wundt. And Wilhelm Wundt, and you say the W's as V's in German, is the father of what we call experimental psychology. And in a lot of ways, modern day psychologists really look to Wundt as the foundation of psychology, and that we could use scientific methods to apply to psychology to have hypothesis and draw conclusions that we can test across the world. In structuralism, what Wundt is trying to do is break it into a basic elements, very much like other sciences like chemistry or physics, where you have a periodic table and you try to organize and break things down clearly into pieces. He's trying to do the same with psychology, and he's trying to do this to the brain. So, structuralists believe that the human minds function by combined objective sensations to subjective feelings. Objective sensations would be things that we can all feel, or we all see are happening and experience, versus our subjective feelings is how we perceive or we think we understand it. So, for example, gravity. If you jump in the air, we're all going to fall to the ground. We all experience gravity. However, how we perceive gravity could be more subjective. Like, you see it as a good thing or a bad thing or a painful thing. The way we taste something is very subjective. You might like tomatoes and I hate tomatoes, or vice versa. So these are the ideas of Wundt. That A, we are trying to make psychology a science. B, we're really trying to break it down into elements and schools and its basic ideas into these structures and pieces that help us understand the process. Now, the big issues with structuralism, of course, would be at the time they are trying to see how the brain sees things, but the way that they're understanding it is through people. So they're asking them questions, trying to understand how they understand their brain. And the person themselves may have perspective and be subjective as opposed to objective and understanding how our brain works. Now, that's changed quite a bit with the MRI and other scientific technologies we have today. And you can see right there, he's doing an experiment on reaction times and trying to see how fast somebody could move and if there's a difference between certain people and our brains and how that works. So, very innovative. Now, James is an American psychologist, and he's really famous. He's with John Dewey, who's the father of American education and the pragmatist, and he, with many others, start the school of functionalism. And functionalism is trying to look at the pieces and bring it together. So it's how we study the mental processes of an organism, like what parts make us who we are and how we understand things. Also, James and the functionalists tend to be more on the perceptive side. They think that you can learn things based on empirical evidence and observational in psychology, maybe as well as research or scientifically. So we can learn quite a bit about people by observation. We could see things and watch human behavior every day, and if we get a big enough sample, or if we do a survey, we can understand how people at least think or perceive things, and that's as important, if not more important, than the research. Now, the Gestalt school of psychology is another German group, and they're against what we'll get into later as behavioralism, and they don't care for structuralism either, breaking it into a science and breaking these down, these pieces, and trying to understand the parts. They don't think that's how psychology works at all. In fact, the Gestalt psychologists really believe that our perception of objects are more than the sum of their parts, the whole that gives the shape and the meaning of the parts. So our perception is very important, if not the most important part of understanding the world around us and how the brain works. So as you can see at the top, I don't know what you guys see there. I want you to think for a second. So some people have said that they see two faces looking at each other, or the other person will say, oh no, we see like a chalice or like a candle holder or something, or some kind of hourglass. So you're seeing the whole picture, and their argument is that that's how your brain is working, is you're seeing the giant screen. You're not breaking into tiny little parts all the time. You're trying to see the whole picture, and your brain is going to fill in those patterns on its own. It's going to make assumptions based on what it thinks it sees. So let's look at these examples here. I want you to look at the picture on the left. Which dot is bigger? Is it the one on the right or the left in picture A? Now, when we ask people after they stare at this, most people will actually say the second one, because really it's an optical illusion. Both dots, the center dots, are the exact same size. However, by having larger dots on the left one, it makes the center dot look smaller, and having smaller dots on the right side makes the central dot look bigger. Just like our perception about food on plates, we know, for example, that if you want to eat less, you should put food on a smaller plate, because then your brain assumes that you have eaten a larger amount of food than you actually have, as opposed to if you have a big plate with a small amount of food, then your brain thinks that you're still hungry and more likely to want to eat more food or to believe you didn't get enough food. So the brain sees things in the big picture and makes assumptions based on these big pictures. That's the Gestalt school of psychology's approach. I want you to look at B now. So on B, you have a pattern, and I want you to see you have A. What do you see here? Can you read this? And a lot of people will say, if they look at the whole thing, which they do, they will say they see A 13, C, D 12, 13, 14, 15. Really, what it is A, B, C, D at the top, 12, 13, 14, and 15 at the bottom. The 13 start looking the same. So they come up with different assumptions because your brain sees the 13 and you look at the whole thing right off the bat. Just like when you're reading a book, if you're a strong reader, you don't phonetically sound out words anymore. You see the first letter and the last letter of a word, and your brain automatically assumes it understands the word. So if you see a T and an E in a word, you'll say the without sounding out and go the. And that's how your brain reads very quickly. Now we're going to go to the next school real quick, and we're going to look at a new father of psychology and some other schools. So here are the dominant schools that we're going to look at the rest of them. We've done structuralism, and we talked about functionalism and the Gestalt school of psychology. Now, and then you have psychoanalysis, humanism, and we're going to break these down. You've got the cognitive perspective, the neuroscientific perspective, the evolutionary perspective, behaviorism will break down quite a bit, and sociocultural perspectives. And these are all different ways of approaching psychology, and many of them are their own schools or they're results of other schools. Like neuroscientific perspective comes from functionalism and structuralism, and cognitive perspective comes from structuralism. It's more scientific. Evolutionary is functional, very scientific, based on breaking things apart and trying to understand observation as well as the science. All right. So many people will tell you the clinical psychologist and the father of psychology is Sigmund Freud. And I'm sure you've heard this name. He was an Austrian psychologist, and he's considered very much the father of psychoanalysis. And we call them modern day psychotherapists. So you have William Wundt is the father of research psychology, and Sigmund Freud is the father of clinical psychology. And clinical psychologists are the ones that meet with us and counsel us for marriage or individually to help deal with people. And most therapists are clinical psychologists. Now, under psychoanalysis, he examines the unconscious psychology that forces within us outside of everyday awareness. Your unconscious wishes and wants is what he assumes. So he assumes that you have a lot of things that are happening in your brain that you're unaware of, and he breaks it down with his theory, and we're going to look at that. Now, some of the challenges with Freud himself is that Freud was actually only working with people that were definitely abnormal psychology people. He was not working with the basis of most people and the general populace and how they perceive the world. He was dealing with extreme situations where people are very unhappy or they have serious mental health issues. And based on that experience, he was making generalizations and assumptions on his bias. So that caused a lot of issues. Also, this is over 100 years ago. So the science of psychology has changed drastically just in the last 2 years. MRIs have gotten, and science has gotten so much better than they have. Could you imagine? The science they had back there was very theoretical, and he makes a lot of theories. So, got some good jokes. How do you know? You guys know any psychology jokes? I'm a Freud not, but I'm bum ching. And then you can see on the other where it says, I see it. How did that make you feel? So the frog is counseling himself. Now, the first concept we're going to talk about, and then we're going to be done today, we'll finish this up in other videos, is subconscious. Freud believed your mind has a subconscious that is made up of your id, ego, and superego. Now, we do have a subconscious, and most evidence points to that because we do what's called subliminal priming. So there are things happening in your brain you don't think about or you're not aware of. However, I don't know if you're going to agree or disagree with Freud's analysis of this. So he is stating that the id is your conscious mind and repressed thoughts. What your dreams mean. The id is that the part of the mind in which you're situated, the instinctual sexual drives which require satisfaction. He thinks we're animalistic, that we are driven very much by our sexual desires to mate and procreate. And that's what's happening, and that's going to come out in our dreams, and a lot of things that we are trying to repress are really coming out of our subconscious mind and our dreams. And that he believed that by analyzing your dreams, you could understand a lot about your subconscious mind. Now, your superego is the part which contains the conscience. Your conscience is what you're actually aware of. Your socially acquired control mechanisms, which have been internalized from society and come from your parents. The things you've been taught. Why you think something's wrong or right. I'm not going to do that. Why am I not going to do that? Because that's wrong. Why can I do that? I can do that because that's fine. That's acceptable by society standards. And he's going to say that this superego is going to try to keep the id, and we're going to find out the ego in check. That we're going to try to filter and stop ourselves. So I'm going to go more in depth on this in the next video.